So for this installment of my series, it's a follow-up on the Quirks and Jerks video, specifically on neutral idle control. I decided to do this one because I'm getting a lot of questions on why does my car bump when I'm starting to take off from a stop? Why does my RPMs bounce a little when I'm going to stop? So this only applies to the automatic cars. If you have a manual, of course they don't have this function, so this wouldn't be for you. And also if you have an engine problem, that's why your idle's bouncing and something like that. So this video is to kind of go over what's considered normal behavior for neutral idle control. So what is neutral idle control and why does Mazda use it? So the concept isn't necessarily new. When the first Skyactivs first launched, they all had it. They still all do. What it does is it puts the car in an altered neutral state depending on how much pressure you have on the brake pedal and whether the engine and transmission temps are above a certain point. Now it's done to keep some of the load off the engine when you're stopped so they can drop some of the fuel consumption down. It's not a feature that I really care for. I don't like how it feels. I've never been inside a OEM car that uses it. It doesn't feel right to me. ZF uses it in some of the 8 speeds and their older 6 speeds. Ford uses it in their 10-speed products. Volkswagen uses it in the 09G, and I think in their new 8-speed. I'm not 100% on that. But the function is there just to release some of the load at idle when you're going to be there for a while. Alright, so we're going to come to a stop. Watch the RPM bounce. We're in neutral idle control. I'm going to slowly let off the gas. Watch it bounce again. There we go. So I'll put it in manual mode. That way we'll guarantee that we won't have neutral idle control. Completely stop. And we're going to start to move again. So what happens when you're at a stop is the transmission output is geared to this. That goes to your ring and pinion on the diff. When your wheels are stopped, the transmission can't move the output, so it's physically stopped. So that's locked here. Your low reverses are on to make first gear. So this planet right here can't turn. Your input clutches spline to this, and they're also splined to the input shaft. So when your input clutches, so the low clutches, when they're fully compressed, they keep the input shaft from turning, and they keep the output shaft from turning. So when you're at 0, your input and your output shaft will be at 0 RPM. Now the converter allows that to happen because then you're having the converter slip with the way they're built. That's just what a converter does. That's why when you come to a stop, your car doesn't stall in an automatic, is because that is still allowing the motion to happen. Alright, so you can see green is engine RPM, blue is turbine or input shaft speed, and then orange is output shaft speed. So we're coming to a stop. Once turbine and output are at 0, then we're not moving. Then the engine just sits there and idles about 750. We start to move again. The blue turbine speed starts to increase. Output shaft speed, because the output shaft speed is increasing, and the car starts to move. All right, so this is the high-low clutch drum. We've talked about that before in some of the other videos. These are the low clutches that sit here. They spline to this. Both these clutches are input clutches. The 3 that sit down here are brake clutches. Input clutches simply cause something to turn. Brake clutches cause something to stop. In this case, it stops the ring gears of the 3 planets for the brake clutches. So these are some of the low clutches pulled out. This is a used one. This is a brand new one that's never been run. Mazda has a discard spec on these clutches of 1.475 millimeters. Every Skyactiv that we've opened, I've taken clutch measurements to see which clutch sets are wearing the most. The low clutches always have the most wear. They're not always past discard, but what we can see here, grab the calipers. So we can see the old one, It's at 1.49 millimeters. And the fresh one's at 1.53. So there is some wear that happens in these clutches. So now, let's say we're in neutral idle control. So low reverses are still on. Output shaft still can't turn. But they also apply the 2/6 brake down here at the bottom. So I'm going to hold all that together. You can see, still, everything here is pretty rigid. The input shaft can still turn, but to allow that to turn, what you'll see in the data is you'll see the RPM of the turbine speed or the input shaft start to climb. That's because they're releasing the clutches that hold that drum that's splined to the input shaft. They're releasing it up to the touch point of those clutches, so they're allowing it to slip. And so it's about 20 to 40, you'll see that in the data. So you're allowing the clutches here to slip while you're holding the entire transmission itself from turning. So what that does is it releases a lot of the load off the engine, because now it's able to turn that fairly easy. It's hard to do with just two hands. But that spinning allows them to release the load. They can drop the torque demand down, fuel down. There it sits. But you are generating some heat, you are generating some slip in that low clutch set. So then when it goes to reapply, so you'll get that bump, because then what's happening is they're reapplying your low clutches here while releasing the 2/6 brake. So by doing that, you release the 2/6 brake. Now these two are timed to happen pretty close. What I don't like, and I've noticed this on pretty much every Skyactiv that I've data logged with this, is when they reapply the low clutch coming out of neutral idle, it's a very slow apply. And so you'll get even more slip before it grabs, and you can kind of feel that in the car. Like, you'll be moving a couple miles an hour and then it'll fully engage. So that's another reason I don't like neutral idle control, is because of the slow engage going back into first gear, which it's not great for a wet clutch set. So this first picture just shows the solenoid application for the low clutch and the 2/6 brake clutch. So 1 amp at the top means it's fully applied, and then 0 would be fully released. So we come to a stop, it goes into neutral idle control. The low clutch is blue, so that releases to about 0.3 amps, which is the kiss point for that clutch set. You can see the 2/6 clutch charges the circuit real quick, backs off, and then fully applies, and then it holds it. Towards the end, when it gets ready to move again, it slowly releases the 2/6 clutch. It bumps the low clutch to fill it, and then it has that really slow apply back up to 1 amp. The vehicle's already started moving by then. You can see that there's a spot, kind of like right as those start to intersect on the back, that there's not a good solid clutch apply, and you'll feel that sometimes when you get moving. It's like a little bump. So here's a complete stop with neutral idle control active. You can see turbine speed goes down to follow output shaft speed, and then it suddenly pops back up, and then you see the engine RPM spike right there. And then you see within about 40 or so RPM across the entire way until we start to get moving again. Then you can see the output shaft speed start to speed. That means the car's starting to move. You can see the turbine speed jump way down and then pop right back up. Then you can see the engine RPM drag down, and then our engine RPM goes up. So what it's doing there is when it's fully clamping back onto the low clutches, and then you're moving again. So both of those points you'll feel in the car as a bump. And if we were to put the car in neutral at a stop, so the low reverse clutches are still on in neutral, the output still can't turn. What it does is it fully releases the low clutch here. So the only thing you've got really turning there is the reduction planet down at the bottom, and that's very little heat generated by turning that, very little load put on the engine while you're just doing it that way in neutral. So what you can see in neutral, you have 1 clutch applied. In neutral idle control, you've actually got 3, because you've got these 2 applied, and then you've got this one partially applied. So in neutral idle control, you actually are using 3 clutches versus neutral, where you're using 1, that actually doesn't change. It's on in park, reverse, neutral, and drive. The only time that lets go is when you're above first gear. So you're applying less clutches. If you just want to put it back in neutral, it just releases that. So to that person's point, saying that you're putting more wear on the transmission, you're not really doing that, because you're actually using less clutches and you're not dragging the low clutch. You can see when you put the car in neutral at a stop, you can see the engine RPM bump up and the turbine shaft speed bump up, and then they follow each other much closer than they do in neutral idle control towards the end. And then I re-engage into drive. You see the turbine speed pulled down, then the car starts moving, so then turbine and output follow the engine RPM. What you can see with them being much closer to each other, if you take those numbers and you average them out, it's about a 15 to 20 RPM slip between engine and turbine. And that's just the natural losses inside the torque converter while it's idling. If you take the difference in the math between that and then what your turbine speed is different from the engine RPM and neutral idle control, that's where you can see your 35 to 40 RPM of slip there versus just a plain neutral.